Yeah.
So, Richard, welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's obviously this evening in New Zealand and this morning here in the UK. So, Richard Bolstad, thank you. You are presenting at the NLP conference this year, and your topic is NLP and Cognitive Clarity. So, do tell us a little bit more about yourself and your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Karen. Well, what I'm actually doing in my life most of all is teaching NLP and training coaches, and I do that in a lot of different places around the world. And one of the things that I noticed over the last few years, especially over the time of the pandemic, was that the people that I'm training seem to develop a different idea about NLP than I intended to give them. And that idea was even different to what I think of as the basic presuppositions of NLP. So, for example, one of the core ideas in NLP is that the map you have inside your head is not the same as the real world. And the way that people seem to be taking that was to think, well, in that case, I've got my ideas about the world and you've got your ideas, and anyone's ideas are as good as anyone else's. And I don't think that was actually what the developers of NLP were intending. I think what I'm intending by NLP anyway is to work out which maps get which results in which situations, so we can work out what's the most effective thing to do in a particular situation to get a particular result. And so that led me to think, okay, what's leading to this misunderstanding? And I realized that we, not just my students, but I myself as well, am operating on a whole lot of core cognitive biases. So human thinking is biased in certain ways. And one of the things about that is that that's not in itself a bad thing. It's not that I think we should all be thinking pure and there's some kind of measurable way that things ought to be. It's more that when we're working with people, we need to understand they're not entirely rational. And we're not as well. And that is actually, that's a gift, because all of our NLP processes depend on it. For example, one of the things that we use all the time in NLP, of course, is this idea of rapport, which is that once I'm synchronized with someone else, if the two of us are synchronized, you're more likely to agree with my ideas just because we feel like we understand each other in an irrational way. Now, that's obviously a big advantage. It's not real necessarily. It's not actually true that people who are synchronized with me have smarter ideas. You know, they just synchronize with me. So we're going to use that in NLP all the time. We're going to use the fact that when things are closer to me, they feel more real and they feel more important when they're actually closer to me. And when they're further away, they don't feel as real and they don't feel as important. We use that in all of our NLP submodality changes. It's not real. Of course, it's not true that the things that are closer to me are more useful or more important and things like that. And that's a particular cognitive bias, to think that the things that I can find on Google easiest are somehow more real than the things that are actually more difficult to find, that I would need to kind of search a little more carefully. And so once I understood that, then I understood, okay, these cognitive biases are a gift, and they are also the source of all of the problems that people generate in their lives. So that's another way of saying the basic NLP ideas, which is that what we're going to do when we work with a client is help them unpack their model of the world and build up a model of the world that works better. And I realize that I need to do that effectively, I need to show people how their cognitive biases are working. Right. And I need to do that in a way that doesn't say, you know, they're wrong for having these cognitive biases, because that's the way human beings work. And what we're doing is we're working out how to hack into the system and actually use it. So for me, that was really exciting, and it gave me a whole opportunity to kind of link with another field outside of NLP, this field of cognitive. There's a whole field of kind of analyzing the way that human beings think, cognition, and to link with that field, and in a sense in the way that the developers of NLP had linked with linguistics. You know, they thought, okay, well, we can use linguistics to explain therapy. And I've been really interested in using cognitive science to explain what I do when I'm working with a client. So this gives you immediately some really, really useful things that you can do better in your session with clients and in your personal life as well. One of the things that you can do is you can actually identify much more systematically, I think, with the list of cognitive biases and the list of what are called cognitive fallacies, misunderstandings like that, the idea that if I feel like something is right, then it must be more realistic, it must be more right. Actually, if I feel like something is right, then it's aligned with my cognitive biases. That's not wrong, but it's also not proof of some special magic of the thing itself. So actually what I do when I'm working with a client, I start off by challenging in an affectionate way, of course, by challenging cognitive biases, by showing them, well, hang on, the problems that you're having are a result of these interesting ways of thinking about them and responding to them. And then I use their cognitive biases. I say, well, we're going to use the same skill, the same bias, the same tendencies you have to help you to make this change. And while I'm doing that, I need to emphasize to them, though, just because you feel better when we do this, that doesn't mean that you suddenly have all the secrets to the universe, and it doesn't mean that you can now let go of paying attention to these cognitive biases. So what I learned as well is it's really important that third section of a coaching session, or that third section of a training, in fact, as well, is to help people to understand that NLP wasn't some magic that magically fixed them and now they don't have to think anymore. Actually, NLP was showing them how to utilize and detect these cognitive biases in their life and future as well. So it's kind of like how to help them protect themselves against their own internal error systems.
Wow, wonderful. So what will delegates take away from your session?
Well, firstly, of course, they'll take away a new way of understanding NLP. That's one really important thing. And a new frame on what they've already been doing is always going to be really useful. The second thing that they'll take away from it, though, is when we look at the lists of language patterns that people learn in NLP, it seems to me that they're kind of random almost. So there's a fantastic list by Robert Dilts, for example, of the sleight of mouth patterns. And these are sometimes called criteria utilization patterns. So, and that is really close to what I'm calling them. Robert Dilts said that he got those by watching Richard Bandler at a time when Richard Bandler was acting crazy. So he modeled what Richard Bandler did when he was acting crazy. And he thought, if we could teach people how to actually do that, we could surely use this for good purposes. Well, that's kind of true. And it's true also that what he has in the sleight of mouth patterns is the structure of how people do craziness. So it's the structure of how they use cognitive fallacies to kid themselves that they've got a logical sort of solution to their life problem. And I think it's quite important that we understand that that's where it came from, because sometimes people have the idea that the sleight of mouth patterns are somehow logical, and they're not intended to be logical. Robert says that pretty clearly. And once you understand cognitive biases, you understand, wow, these are all the cognitive fallacies that people usually are using. So it gives you a new way of understanding all these language patterns, and that makes it easier for you to use them. On the other side, for example, in Ericksonian hypnotherapy, it gives us a whole new way of understanding how Milton Erickson worked, a whole new set of categories for what he was doing. Because I think, Robert was analysing Richard Bandler's work, but when we look at Milton Erickson's use of language patterns, he always said that what he was doing was utilising. Yeah. And what way that I understand it now is that he was utilising normal cognitive biases. So he knew a lot about the way that people tend to think. When we're doing rapport, we're utilizing this bias that people have to kind of believe someone who they feel synchronized with. When we do a submodality shift, we're utilizing the fact, for example, that when something's closer to me, it feels more real. It's not, but it feels that way. And this, of course, is a cognitive bias, so that when you look on the internet, the first thing you find, you think, oh my goodness, that's the real answer. And that seems more important than what's on page 3 of your search, but it's not. It's just a bias that the easiest thing to get feels like the most real. So so this gives us an incredible new way of having flexibility with these language patterns that Erickson used, flexibility with what Robert Dilts was using, and a kind of overview of them all. For me, that's a really useful thing to take away, to be able to immediately understand where am I in terms of what useful language patterns will help this person to change, and what's an overview of all the language patterns that I've ever learned on any NLP training. So that's something that I really believe that people will get out of this. One of the other things that I think is important about this is that I think we're at a time in history when it's crucial that people have the ability to reality test. And over the last 3 years, we've seen the development of this thing that's called conspirituality often. And that sounds very fancy, but it's what used to be called cults. So often people say NLP is kind of like a cult. And it could be if we didn't understand that what we're doing is deliberately utilizing people's biases. Once we understand that and we're upfront about it and we explain it to them, we're like an anti-cult. And that's something that I want people to take away from this, is the idea that NLP can be an anti-cult, that it can be an anti-craziness kind of skill, that it can be an anti-conspiracy kind of skill. And I think that's really, really precious for us at this time in history to have a very clear set of tools that can help people work out what's real and what's not real. Because some things simply are more useful to believe and some things are less useful to believe.
Absolutely, and I love your analogy with Google, that it's the things that are easiest to access must be the right things. That makes it so easy to understand what you're explaining. So thank you. So is there anything that delegates can do beforehand to give them a deeper experience during your session?
Yep, they can certainly download the book on Kindle, of course, or get a hard copy of the book. And if you go to my site, my internet site at transformations.org.nz, then there are many articles about this. And it's not the same as making contact in a session, because you don't get a sense of, well, because it doesn't trigger your cognitive biases as well. That's the reality of it, is that person to person is the way that we're biased to work best. So I still encourage people to come to the sessions, and at transformations.org.nz, you can read lots of this beforehand so that you have printed out lots of examples of how to use it, things like that. We'll play with these things, of course, when I'm doing that session.
Brilliant. So Richard, I mean, you've presented at the conference before, and we're very lucky that that you're delivering a 3-hour session at the conference later this year. So what does the NLP International Conference mean to you?
Oh, I was so grateful to have that opportunity last year, and I'm so excited to be coming back this year. I mean, I think that what you're doing with this conference is an extraordinary thing for NLP in general. There are many conferences, but there's only one of this conference each year, and that is, I think it occupies a unique place in the NLP world because it's reliable. I know your background, for example, that you've written this amazing book on being an NLP professional. And I think that's what the conference is part of providing us, is not just a gathering of people talking, but a real professional grounding for us as people who want to work with people and be credible in the world. And so in the same way that I would want to know that my medical, this is something I know you've said, in the same way I'd want to know that my medical practitioner has not just gone and presented at a funded pharmaceutical conference or something, but they've actually gone to conferences that make a difference in their field. I would say to people, come to this conference because it genuinely is, it's a professional conference. That's the way I think of it. And I feel so grateful to be able to be back in that experience with of course, so many amazing trainers who I want to learn from myself. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, I mean, we are so lucky. This year is the first year we're doing a hybrid conference. So we've got one weekend in person and one weekend virtually. And that's what enables people be able to join us, which is wonderful. So for you to join us, I mean, it's going to be a very late night for you. I appreciate that, because you'll be delivering your presentation at 9 a.m. BST. And you'll be carrying on because it's for 3 hours. It's going to be, it won't finish, and there'll be a break in the middle as well. So it won't finish till 12:30 BST our time. So it's going to be quite late for you, and we're very appreciative that you're going to stay up late and deliver this for us. So Richard is presenting, as I said, NLP and Cognitive Clarity on Saturday, the 20th of May, starting at 9 a.m. BST. We've got 3 hours to deep dive into what I think is going to be really, really enlightening for all NLP professionals to learn about this cognitive bias. So thank you so much, Richard. Very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks for having this discussion about it as well. It's exciting.